So there I was, Maya Rodriguez, standing in the main lobby of the Galactic Defense Academy watching a 17-foot-tall purple octopus argue with what looked like a sentient houseplant about proper filing procedures. You know, just another Tuesday in space. The Academy was exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of aliens with too much time and not enough common sense. Everything was chrome, glass, and that weird blue lighting that makes everyone look like they're dying of hypothermia. The ceiling stretched up about 3 miles, because apparently when you can manipulate gravity, subtlety becomes optional. "Cadet Rodriguez!" The voice boomed across the lobby like a foghorn having an existential crisis. I turned to see Commander Zeltok marching toward me, all 8 feet of bureaucratic fury wrapped in what looked like a military uniform designed by someone who'd only heard uniforms described over a bad phone connection. Zeltok was one of those aliens that made you wonder if evolution was just taking requests at some point. Picture a flamingo, but make it gray, give it 4 arms, and let it develop a superiority complex that would make a Beverly Hills real estate agent look humble. "Commander," I said, offering my most diplomatic smile, which, let's be honest, was about as diplomatic as a brick through a window. "You are precisely 14 minutes and 37 seconds late for orientation," he informed me, consulting what appeared to be a holographic clipboard, because apparently even in the future, middle management still needs clipboards. "Sorry, I got lost trying to find the bathroom. Your signs are in 17 different languages, none of which are pictures of toilets." Behind Zeltok, a gelatinous blob in a professor's coat was frantically flipping through what looked like a manual titled Deathworlder Safety Protocols 3rd Emergency Revision. This would be Professor Quilbert, my assigned cultural integration specialist, which I was pretty sure was Academy speak for the guy who gets to explain to your parents why you died. "And Rodriguez?" Quilbert gurgled, his voice like someone gargling marbles in jello. "I must stress the importance of following all safety guidelines during your tenure here. Humans are classified as Class 7 Deathworlders, which means, I interrupted, that according to your bureaucratic wisdom, I'm basically a walking natural disaster who might accidentally genocide someone by sneezing too hard." The blob professor made a sound like a deflating whoopee cushion. "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound rather absurd, but the regulations clearly state—" "The regulations?" Commander Zeltok cut in with the kind of authority that suggested he'd practiced that line in the mirror. "Exist for the safety of all students. Your species has a documented history of surviving planetary conditions that would instantly kill 93.7% of known sentient life." I looked around the lobby again. A student who appeared to be made entirely of crystalline formations was having a casual conversation with something that looked like it belonged in a lava lamp. In the corner, a group of what I assumed were underclassmen were playing some sort of game that involved floating geometric shapes and a lot of excited chittering. "Right," I said slowly. "So let me get this straight. You invited the first human to your fancy space academy, knowing full well that we're apparently the galactic equivalent of feral honey badgers, and now you're surprised that this might require some adjustment?" Quilbert's gelatinous form rippled in what I was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of nervous laughter. When the Board of Admissions approved the first human exchange program, they were quite excited about the cultural diversity aspects. The practical implications were perhaps not fully considered. "Practical implications," I repeated, watching a maintenance drone carefully sanitize the area where I'd been standing. "You mean like the fact that I apparently radiate danger just by existing?" "Not danger per se," Zeltok clarified with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been asked this question before. "More like concentrated survival instincts that might manifest in unexpected ways during standard academy interactions." I couldn't help but grin. This was going to be more fun than I thought. Of course, no self-respecting space academy would be complete without its own collection of insufferable elite students. Enter the Hegemony 7, because apparently even in a galaxy full of diverse alien species, rich kids still travel in packs and think they own the place. I first encountered them in what the Academy generously called the Recreation Sphere, which was basically a mall food court designed by someone who'd clearly never seen a food court but had once heard someone describe one during a fever dream. The 7 of them were lounging around a floating platform, looking like they were posing for the galaxy's most pretentious yearbook photo. Their leader was Vex Shadowclaw, and yes, that was actually his name. I couldn't tell if his parents hated him or if he'd legally changed it to sound more intimidating. Picture a dinosaur that went to business school and developed opinions about wine. He was all scales, sharp teeth, and the kind of arrogance that could be detected from orbit. "So," Shadowclaw announced to his little entourage, his voice carrying across the recreation area like he was delivering the State of the Galaxy address. "The Academy has finally scraped the bottom of the evolutionary barrel." Next to him floated Quantum, who wasn't so much a being as a collection of angry lightning held together by smugness. When he spoke, it sounded like someone tuning a radio during a thunderstorm. "A human," he crackled, dismissively. "How charmingly primitive." Then there was Thoraxia, an insectoid whose 6 arms were apparently not enough to contain her sense of superiority. She clicked and chittered in what I assumed was her species' version of snickering. "I heard they still use chemical propulsion to achieve orbit," she buzzed. "How delightfully rustic." The gaseous one, Nebulous, swirled in patterns that somehow managed to look condescending. His voice was like wind through a cave, if caves were particularly judgmental. "My molecular structure contains elements that didn't exist on their homeworld until they invented nuclear fusion. They're practically still using stone tools." Christek, who looked like someone had taught a rock formation how to be disappointed, rumbled his agreement. "My homeworld's children learn to manipulate quantum fields before they can walk. This one probably still believes in linear time." Fludon, the shapeshifter, had taken the form of something that looked vaguely humanoid but better, because subtlety was apparently not taught at Rich Alien Kid University. "I can restructure my entire molecular composition at will," he gurgled. "She probably needs tools to change the color of her primitive keratin strands." And finally, Psyche, a gray-skinned, large-eyed creature who looked like every alien abduction story come to life, was apparently conducting a telepathic commentary for the group's amusement. "Her mental patterns are so simplistic," he observed, with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for discussing bacteria. I watched this entire display from across the recreation area, munching on what the food synthesizer had optimistically labeled Earth-style nutrition paste, but tasted like someone's childhood memory of cardboard. The 7 of them were putting on quite the performance, and I had to admit, it was impressive in the way that watching a particularly elaborate train wreck was impressive. Shadowclaw stood up from his floating platform, all 8 feet of reptilian superiority on full display. "Perhaps we should introduce ourselves to our new classmate," he said, the word classmate dripping with enough disdain to water a small garden. "After all, it would be rude not to welcome the Academy's newest charity case. Now, I want to be clear about something. I came to this Academy with the best of intentions. I was going to be diplomatic, cultural, maybe even friendly. I was going to be the shining example of human-alien cooperation that would make the recruitment brochures and inspire a generation of interspecies harmony." That plan lasted about as long as it took the Hegemony 7 to saunter over to my table. I was sitting in what the Academy called the Cultural Integration Cafeteria, which was basically a regular cafeteria but with the added challenge of trying to figure out which of the floating food items wouldn't kill you. I'd managed to identify something that looked vaguely like a sandwich if sandwiches were made by aliens who'd only heard rumors about bread. Well, Shadowclaw announced as he approached, his entourage forming a semicircle around my table, like they were about to perform some sort of intimidation ritual. The primitive Deathworlder, dining alone. How tragically appropriate. I looked up from my questionable meal and gave them my best customer service smile. You know the one, where your mouth says, "How can I help you?" but your eyes say, "I've already planned 17 different ways to end you." "Hi there," I said cheerfully. "You guys lost? Or just practicing your dramatic entrances?" But Quantum crackled with what I assumed was supposed to be menacing energy. "You should show proper respect when addressing your betters, human." "My betters?" I repeated, taking another bite of my alien sandwich. "Wow, that's adorable. Did you guys rehearse this? Or is condescension just your species' natural state?" Thoraxia's 6 arms clicked in agitation. "Your species hasn't even achieved basic cellular manipulation. You're barely evolved past your primal ancestors." "Right," I nodded thoughtfully. "And yet somehow we managed to get invited to your fancy academy. That must really sting, huh? Being shown up by a bunch of barely evolved primates." Nebulous swirled ominously, which for a gas cloud was probably the equivalent of flexing. "Your admission here is clearly some sort of administrative error, a cosmic joke. Or maybe," I suggested, and just hear me out here, maybe the galaxy's most prestigious military academy thought it might be useful to have students who don't fold like origami the first time someone looks at them funny. Christek rumbled what sounded like laughter, but meaner. "You think your crude survival instincts make you strong? We have mastered forces you cannot even comprehend." "Mastered forces," I repeated slowly. Like what, the force of gravity? Because I've got to tell you, I've been dealing with that one since birth. Really builds character. Fluidon rippled into a more aggressive configuration. Your sarcasm cannot hide your obvious inferiority, human. We are evolved beings, perfected through millennia of advancement. Perfected? I mused. Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a group therapy session for beings with severe self-esteem issues. That's when Psyche decided to get involved, his large eyes narrowing as he attempted what I assumed was some sort of telepathic intimidation. Your mind is an open book, human. I can see your primitive thoughts, your base instincts. Oh, really? I leaned back in my chair. And what exactly are you seeing in there? Fear, he announced triumphantly. Beneath all that bravado, you're terrified of us. I couldn't help but laugh. Buddy, if that's what you're picking up, you might want to get your psychic powers serviced. What you're sensing isn't fear. Then what? Shadowclaw demanded, leaning forward with those razor-sharp teeth on full display. I stood up slowly, very aware that this conversation was rapidly approaching the point of no return. The cafeteria had gone suspiciously quiet, like everyone could sense that something was about to go very wrong for somebody. Recognition, I said simply. I'm recognizing the exact moment when 7 supposedly superior beings decided to corner one supposedly inferior human and make it her problem. The energy in the room shifted, even Quantum's crackling seemed to intensify. You see, I continued, brushing imaginary crumbs off my uniform, where I come from we have a saying, don't start none, won't be none. But you guys seem determined to start some, so… Shadowclaw's laugh was like broken glass in a blender. Are you threatening us, human? One primitive Deathworlder against 7 of the galaxy's elite? Your species may be good at surviving, but we are trained warriors. Trained warriors, I repeated, and I could hear the exact moment in my voice where diplomacy packed its bags and left town. Well then, this should be educational for everybody. What happened next probably deserves some sort of scientific study, maybe a documentary, definitely a warning label. 9 seconds. That's all it took to turn 7 of the galaxy's most arrogant beings into a cautionary tale about why you don't mess with Deathworlders. Second one. Shadowclaw made the first move, because of course he did. 8 feet of reptilian superiority lunged forward with claws extended, probably expecting me to cower or scream or do whatever he thought primitive humans did when faced with imminent dismemberment. Instead, I stepped sideways, grabbed his outstretched arm, and used his own momentum to introduce his face to the nearest table with a sound like a gong having an identity crisis. His internal monologue probably went something like, wait, that's not how this was supposed to go, right before it went, ow, 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 why is everything spinning? Second two, Quantum, being made of pure energy, figured he had the advantage of not having a face to introduce to furniture. He crackled forward, probably planning to give me the galaxy's worst static shock. Unfortunately for him, I'd grown up in a house with faulty wiring and a cat that generated electricity just by existing. I grabbed the metal chair I'd been sitting on and swung it through his energy form like I was playing the world's most dangerous game of badminton. Turns out, electrical beings really don't like sudden conductivity changes. Who knew? He dispersed with a sound like a radio being thrown into a bathtub, his consciousness probably screaming something along the lines of, "This is not scientifically possible." Second three, Thoraxia came at me with all 6 arms flailing, which looked intimidating until you realized it was basically like being attacked by an angry windmill. Her species had probably evolved those extra limbs for delicate manipulation tasks, not combat. I ducked under her wild swings, grabbed 2 of her arms, and spun her around like I was at the world's weirdest dance competition. She went flying into the wall with a chittering sound that was probably insectoid for, I've made a terrible mistake. Second 4, Nebulous tried to engulf me, which was actually a decent strategy if you're fighting someone who needs to breathe a specific atmospheric composition. Too bad for him that humans are basically the galaxy's most stubborn life support system. I held my breath, grabbed a food tray, and started fanning him away from me like he was cigarette smoke at a bus stop. Gas clouds, it turns out, really hate rapid air movement. He dispersed across the cafeteria, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere with what sounded like gaseous profanity. Second 5. Christic rumbled forward like a living avalanche, probably thinking his rock-hard exterior made him invincible. Here's the thing about living on a death world. You learn to break rocks with whatever tools you have available. I grabbed a sonic learning device from a nearby table, cranked it to maximum volume, and held it right against his crystalline structure. The feedback was incredible. He shattered into about 17 pieces, each one vibrating with what I can only assume was mineral-based regret. Second 6. Fluidon tried to be clever, shifting into a form that looked like me but bigger and more threatening. Classic intimidation tactic. Except he made one crucial error. He assumed looking human would give him human capabilities. Instead, he got human limitations with none of the experience. I punched him right in what he'd shaped to look like a face, and he splashed apart like a water balloon, his liquid form hitting the ceiling with a wet slap that was probably shapeshifter, for why didn't anyone mention they hit this hard? Second 7. Psych tried to get into my head, probably planning some sort of telepathic assault that would leave me a drooling mess. Unfortunately for him, he picked the worst possible moment to go spelunking around in a human brain. Human thoughts during combat are basically pure chaos. Adrenaline, tactical assessment, random song lyrics, grocery lists, and the overwhelming urge to make sure the other guy has a worse day than you do. He grabbed his oversized head and stumbled backward, his mental voice probably screaming something like, "What is this nightmare of random thoughts, and why does she have a song about food stuck on repeat?" Second 8. I stood there for a moment, looking around at the carnage, doing a quick head count to make sure I'd accounted for everyone. 7 aliens, 7 different ways of ending up on the floor, ceiling, or dispersed throughout the local atmosphere. Second 9. I dusted off my hands, straightened my uniform, and turned to face the crowd of stunned onlookers who had gathered to watch what they probably thought would be my humiliation. Instead, they got a masterclass in why evolution isn't about being sophisticated, it's about being effective. That's when Academy security decided to make their grand entrance, rushing into the cafeteria with the kind of urgency usually reserved for natural disasters or containment breaches. They stopped dead when they saw the scene, one human standing calmly in the middle of what looked like the aftermath of a small war, while 7 of the Academy's elite students were scattered around the room in various states of defeat and embarrassment. The head of security, a being that looked like a cross between a tree and a filing cabinet, stared at me with what I assumed was disbelief. "What exactly happened here, Cadet Rodriguez?" I shrugged, the very picture of innocence. They said they were trained warriors. I guess we had different definitions of training. 23 minutes later, I was sitting in Commander Zeltalk's office, which looked like someone had let a bureaucrat loose in a spaceship design studio with unlimited funding and a severe anxiety disorder. Everything was chrome, glass, and organized to within an inch of its artificial life. Even his desk plants were arranged in perfect geometric patterns, because apparently even Flora had to follow regulations in this place. Zeltalk himself was pacing behind his desk like a flamingo having an existential crisis, his forearms gesticulating wildly as he consulted various holographic displays that kept popping up around him like digital dandelions. Professor Quilbert was in the corner, his gelatinous form rippling with what I was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of a nervous breakdown. 7 students, Zeltalk announced to the room, as if I might have forgotten. 7 of our most elite cadets, in the medical bay, simultaneously. "Well," I said helpfully, "technically Nebulos is in the atmospheric reclamation unit. He's not really medical bay material, being a gas cloud and all." The commander's beak-like appendage twitched in what I assumed was either suppressed rage or a minor stroke. "The medical reports," he continued, consulting yet another holographic clipboard, "make for fascinating reading." He cleared his throat, which for his species sounded like a rusty gate having an argument with a dying accordion. "Shadowclaw, severe cranial trauma, multiple lacerations, and what the doctors described as acute reality adjustment syndrome. Quantum, complete molecular dispersal requiring 6 hours of energy pattern reconstruction. Thoraxia, compound fractures in 4 of 6 appendages, plus what appears to be motion sickness so severe she's forgotten how to fly." In my defense, I interjected, "I didn't know she could fly." "Christic," he continued, pointedly ignoring me, "required complete molecular restructuring after suffering what the geology department described as catastrophic resonance failure. Fluidon is currently in a specialized containment unit while his cellular cohesion restabilizes. Nebulous has been scattered across 3 different atmospheric processors, and our maintenance crew is still trying to collect all of him." Professor Quilbert made a sound like a deflating balloon. "And Psyche," he gurgled mournfully, "is in intensive psychiatric care after what he described as accidentally experiencing human combat consciousness. He keeps muttering something about grocery lists and a song about fried chicken." I nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, I get that stuck in my head when I'm stressed. Catchy tune." Zeltalk stopped pacing and fixed me with all 4 of his eyes, which was an unsettling experience that made me feel like I was being examined by a very disappointed surveillance system. "Cadet Rodriguez, these were not just any students. These were the sons and daughters of some of the most influential beings in the galaxy. Vex Shadowclaw's father owns 3 star systems. Quantum's energy signature is registered as a strategic resource by 17 different governments. Wow, I said. So they're rich kids with daddy issues. That explains so much. What exactly? Zeltok asked, with the kind of patience usually reserved for dealing with particularly dense children. Did you think you were accomplishing by assaulting 7 fellow students? I leaned back in my chair, which was clearly designed for someone with a completely different skeletal structure than mine. Well, Commander, here's the thing. They cornered me. They made threats. They clearly intended to demonstrate their superiority through physical violence. I just happened to be better at violence than they were. Better at violence, he repeated slowly, like he was trying to translate the concept into something his brain could process. It's a human thing, I explained. We come from what you guys keep calling a death world, right? That means we've spent our entire evolutionary history getting really, really good at not dying. Sometimes that involves being better at making other things stop trying to kill us than they are at trying to kill us. Professor Quilbert consulted his manual again, his form rippling with increased agitation. The Deathworlder safety protocols clearly state that humans should be monitored for signs of aggressive behavior, but they don't specify what to do when the aggressive behavior is successful. Successful, Zeltok repeated, his voice taking on the tone of someone who just realized his carefully organized world was built on fundamentally flawed assumptions. Look, I said, trying to be reasonable. I didn't want to fight anyone. I came here to learn, maybe make some friends, represent my species with dignity and grace, but 7 alien bullies decided to corner me and make it clear that they intended to put me in my place through intimidation and physical dominance. And your response to intimidation was to single-handedly defeat 7 trained combatants in under 10 seconds? Zeltok asked. 9 seconds, I corrected. And in my defense, if they were trained combatants, somebody seriously needs to review the training program. The commander made a sound like a deflating accordion mixed with a dying computer. According to Academy regulations, unprovoked assault on fellow students results in immediate expulsion and potential criminal charges. Unprovoked? I raised an eyebrow. Commander, with all due respect, did anyone bother to check the security footage? Because I'm pretty sure it'll show 7 students surrounding 1 student, making threats and initiating physical contact. Quilbert rippled nervously. We did review the footage, he admitted. The audio clearly shows escalating verbal aggression from all parties, followed by Shadowclaw making the first physical move. So technically, I said with my most innocent smile, this was self-defense against multiple attackers who were, and I quote from your own evaluation, trained warriors. Zeltok stared at me for a long moment, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence like a malfunctioning traffic light. You're telling me that in 9 seconds, 1 untrained human successfully defended herself against 7 elite alien students using nothing but, what exactly? Basic physics, I shrugged. Leverage, momentum, understanding of structural weaknesses, and about 18 years of growing up on a planet that's actively trying to kill everything that lives on it. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet you usually hear right before someone realizes they've made a terrible mistake. 3 days later, the Academy implemented what they officially called the Enhanced Safety Protocols for High-Risk Species Integration, but what everyone else started calling the Maya Rodriguez Protocols. Apparently, having 1 human accidentally demonstrate that their elite students were about as combat effective as a strongly worded memo had caused some serious reevaluation of their risk assessment procedures. The new rules were, frankly, hilarious. Human students were now required to wear monitoring devices that tracked everything from heart rate to adrenaline levels. Any reading above mildly annoyed triggered an automatic alert to Academy security. They'd installed what they called de-escalation fields in all common areas, which were basically fancy mood rings for rooms that would start playing soothing music the moment they detected elevated stress levels from any human present. My personal favorite was the new mandatory class called Understanding Deathworlder Psychology, which was taught by Professor Quilbert, and basically amounted to 45 minutes of him nervously explaining to other alien students why they shouldn't corner humans in dark spaces, make threatening gestures, or assume that being from an advanced civilization made them superior fighters. The human response to perceived threats, Quilbert would gurgle to his captive audience, is not governed by rational analysis of relative technological capabilities. It is governed by approximately 4 billion years of evolutionary programming, designed to ensure survival at any cost. The Hegemony 7, meanwhile, had become something of a cautionary tale. Shadowclaw's father had apparently spent the equivalent of a small planet's GDP on reconstructive surgery and psychological counseling. The poor reptilian was still jumping at shadows and flinching whenever he heard the sound of chairs scraping against floors. Word around campus was that he'd developed a nervous habit of checking over his shoulder whenever he entered a room, as if he expected tables to spontaneously leap out and attack his face. Quantum had recovered physically, but his energy patterns had somehow retained a permanent flinch response. Every time someone moved too quickly near him, he'd disperse slightly, like he was getting ready to scatter. The energy physics department was calling it post-traumatic static disorder and writing papers about it. Thoraxia had regained full use of all 6 arms, but she'd apparently developed an irrational fear of spinning objects. Ceiling fans, rotating doors, even the Academy's centrifuge training equipment would send her into chittering panic attacks. The medical staff said it would probably fade with time, but for now she was taking all her classes in rooms with strictly linear motion only. The others had their own various adjustment issues. Chris Tech couldn't listen to music anymore without having flashbacks to his catastrophic resonance failure. Fluidin had developed an obsessive need to maintain perfect molecular cohesion at all times, which meant he'd basically locked himself into one shape and refused to change it. Nebulos wouldn't enter enclosed spaces anymore, convinced that any room might contain hidden fans ready to disperse him, and poor Psyche had been put on mandatory meditation leave, after what the psychiatrist termed accidental telepathic contamination by chaotic human thought patterns. But here's the really interesting part. After the initial shock wore off, something unexpected happened. Instead of ostracizing me, the rest of the student body started treating me with a kind of nervous respect that bordered on reverence. Apparently, being the first person to ever completely humble the Hegemony 7 had earned me a reputation as someone you definitely didn't want to mess with. Students would step aside in the hallways, not out of fear exactly, but out of the kind of respectful caution you'd show a sleeping tiger. Conversations would pause when I entered a room, not because people were afraid of me, but because they were genuinely curious about the human who'd accidentally redefined the Academy's understanding of combat effectiveness. The really amusing part was watching the faculty try to figure out how to handle me. On one hand, I'd technically assaulted 7 fellow students. On the other hand, the security footage clearly showed it was self-defense against multiple attackers. On the third hand, which several species actually had, I'd done it so efficiently and thoroughly that it raised serious questions about the Academy's combat training programs. Commander Zeltuk had taken to speaking to me in the same tone you'd use with a potentially unstable explosive device. Polite, respectful, but with the underlying awareness that the wrong word might result in catastrophic consequences for everyone in the immediate vicinity. "Cadet Rodriguez," he'd said during our final meeting about the incident, "the Board of Admissions has decided that your unique approach to conflict resolution represents a valuable learning opportunity for all students." "You mean I'm not expelled?" I'd asked, genuinely surprised. "On the contrary," he'd replied, consulting yet another holographic clipboard. "You've been selected as a case study for the new interspecies combat dynamics curriculum. Apparently, the Military Applications Department is very interested in studying human tactical thinking." So there I was, 3 months into my Academy career, officially designated as both an educational resource and a walking example of why you should never assume that advanced technology equals advanced capability. I'd become the living embodiment of the galaxy's newest military axiom: never underestimate a species that evolved in a gravity well with an attitude problem. And the best part? The Hegemony 7 had slowly, grudgingly started treating me not as an inferior primitive, but as someone who'd earned their respect the hard way. Shadowclaw still flinched when I walked by, but he'd started nodding politely instead of sneering. Quantum had even attempted what I think was supposed to be an apology, though it came out as a series of electrical pulses that sounded like a microwave having an existential crisis. As I sat in the recreation sphere, watching a new group of first-year students give me a wide berth while they whispered among themselves, I couldn't help but smile. I'd come to the Galactic Defense Academy to learn about other species and represent humanity with dignity and grace. Mission accomplished, I guess. I'd certainly taught them something about humans, even if it wasn't exactly what anyone had planned. And the best part was, the new Academy motto they'd quietly added to the handbook: excellence through diversity, understanding through experience, and never, ever corner the Deathworlder in the cafeteria.